Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. The rain had been falling all afternoon, a steady patter against the kitchen windows. I was rinsing out a mug, staring absently into the gray light beyond the glass. My husband, Daniel, had left early that morning for a business trip that would keep him away for 3 days. I told myself the emptiness in the house was peaceful, but the truth was, it was lonely. That's when I heard the back door open without a knock. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Aaron. Aaron had been Daniel's closest friend for years, the kind of man who always offered to help fix things around the house, who laughed easily, who noticed little details about me Daniel never seemed to. But lately, his visits had shifted in tone. The silences between us felt charged, the air too thick. Thought I'd check if he needed the leak under the sink looked at, he said, setting his jacket over the chair. His voice was calm, casual, but when he walked closer, I caught the way his eyes moved over me. I told myself I'd just stay where I was. My hands still in the warm dishwater, let him check the pipes and leave. But then he came to stand right beside me, close enough that I could feel the faint heat radiating from him. He leaned past me, reaching for something on the counter, and his hand brushed against my hip. Not an accident, not with the way his touch lingered. I froze, the glass mug still in my hand. My heart thudded so hard it drowned out the rain. "Aaron," I whispered, my voice meant to be a warning, but it came out softer, almost uncertain. He didn't step back. Instead, his hand settled more firmly at my side, his thumb grazing the fabric of my shirt. The moment felt too big, too impossible to undo. I should have moved, I should have told him to stop. But instead, I stayed still, my breath catching in my throat. "I've thought about this for too long," he said quietly, his breath warm against my ear. "Long before I should have." I didn't answer. My fingers gripped the edge of the sink, as if that would keep me steady. He wasn't gentle at first. His movements had an urgency, a roughness that betrayed how long he'd been holding back. But beneath it was something else, a kind of need that made my own pulse race. The room felt small, the air heavy with the smell of rain and dish soap. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that Daniel's face would haunt me, but my body stayed rooted there, unable to step away. When Aaron finally pulled back, his chest rising and falling hard, we didn't speak. The rain kept falling. I stayed by the sink, staring out into the storm, wondering how something so brief could feel so irreversible. I knew when Daniel came home, I'd greet him like nothing had happened. But inside, everything had shifted. The kitchen sank, the smell of rain, Aaron's voice in my ear. They would never feel the same again. The rain didn't stop that night. It went on for hours after Aaron left, a steady percussion on the roof that made the house feel smaller than it was. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment at the kitchen sink, the brush of his hand, the way he'd spoken so close to my ear, how I'd stayed still. When Daniel called to check in from his hotel, I forced my voice to sound normal. I asked about his meetings, pretended to be folding laundry, pretended I wasn't standing right where Aaron had stood just hours ago. Over the next 2 days, I kept expecting my guilt to fade, but instead it deepened. Not into shame, but into something more dangerous. Curiosity. Aaron came back the following afternoon. I told myself it was just to fix the leak, but the way his eyes held mine as he walked in told me it was more than that. He worked under the sink while I pretended to sort through mail. We didn't talk much, but the air between us felt like a live wire, humming and dangerous. When he finished, I thought he'd leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me as I tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm fine." My voice was too quick, too defensive. He smirked slightly, like he knew exactly what I was. Thinking, no, you're not. I should have told him to stop. Instead, I stepped toward him. Not much, just enough that the space between us felt like a decision. We didn't touch. Not that day. But the look in his eyes told me we both knew we would dot by the time Daniel returned from his trip. I built an entire world in my head around Aaron. Every time my husband spoke, I found myself half listening, half waiting for the next excuse to see his friend dot. It came sooner than I expected. A week later, Daniel invited Aaron over for a quick drink before they went to watch the game at a bar. I spent the whole time pretending I didn't feel his gaze from across the room. When Daniel went upstairs to grab his jacket, Aaron's hand brushed mine as he set his glass down. The touch was fleeting but electric. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming with equal parts fear and desire. "Don't," I whispered. He tilted his head slightly, his voice low. "Then tell me you don't want this." I didn't say anything. My silence was its own confession. Over the next few weeks, we found moments, brief, stolen ones. A conversation on the back porch when no one else was around. A brush of his fingers against my arm as he passed me in the hall. A lingering look across a crowded room. Each time the tension grew heavier, until the weight of it became unbearable. It broke on another rainy evening, almost exactly like the first. Daniel was away again, and Aaron came over claiming he'd been driving past and saw my lights on. We stood in the kitchen, the storm raging outside. "You don't move," he said quietly, stepping closer, "and it drives me insane." I didn't move now either. I stayed right where I was, my hands on the counter, my heartbeat loud in my ears. His touch this time wasn't hurried. It was deliberate, controlled, almost reverent in the way it unfolded. We both knew there was no turning back after that dot. When it was over, we didn't speak for a long while. He just rested his hand on the counter beside mine, our fingers almost touching. "I shouldn't," I began, but the words died on my tongue. "I know," he said. "But you did." And that was it. The truth we'd both been circling around since that first day by the kitchen sink. The sound of the rain was softer now, but inside me, the storm had only just begun. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had been fractured, broken into restless pieces. My mind returning again and again to the moment Aaron's voice brushed against my ear. It had been nothing, and yet everything. My coffee went cold on the counter while I stared out at the wet garden, still damp from last night's rain. I told myself I wouldn't see him again unless Daniel was around. That was the safest way. But telling myself that and wanting it were two different things. The leak under the sink was fixed. Yet 3 days later, Aaron texted me, "Hey, I think your back gate is loose. Want me to stop by?" I stared at my phone far too long before answering. If you're passing by dot, he showed up 20 minutes later. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. I opened the door, and for a moment we just looked at each other, neither speaking, as though acknowledging a shared memory. Neither of us should admit to. We walked out to the back garden where he tightened the gate's hinge. It was simple, mundane work, but there was nothing mundane about the space between us. I stood too close, my hand brushing his arm when I passed him the wrench. His head tilted toward me slightly, not enough to touch, but enough to make me feel. Every nerve in my body sparked to life. "Still quiet," he murmured without looking at me. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could. When he finished, we went back inside. He lingered at the counter, his hand resting on the same place it had before. My gaze dropped to it, then rose slowly to meet his eyes. "I can't keep coming here," he said finally. Voice low. I swallowed hard. "Then don't." But we both knew he didn't mean it. 2 weeks passed without a word from him. It was almost enough time for the memory to fade, until Daniel invited him over for a Saturday barbecue. I wore a sundress that felt innocent enough but clung to me when the breeze caught it. The whole afternoon, I felt his eyes. When Daniel stepped inside to grab more drinks, Aaron passed behind me, close enough that his hand brushed my back. The touch was so quick, anyone watching would think nothing of it. But I felt it everywhere. Later, as he left, he said it under his breath. "Next time, I'm not walking away." That next time came sooner than I expected. Daniel had a late meeting. Aaron came by, claiming he'd left his jacket after the barbecue. I knew it was an excuse the moment I opened the door. He stepped into the kitchen, the same place everything had started. The air felt charged, thick. "You still staying still?" he asked. I didn't move. Not when he stepped closer. Not when his hand rested lightly on my hip. Not when he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Say no and I'll stop." I couldn't. I wouldn't. We crossed the line that night, not rushed, not clumsy, but with a slow inevitability that made it impossible to pretend it was an accident. Every touch was deliberate. Every pause was a choice. When it was over, we stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, neither of us speaking. His hand found mine, fingers curling briefly before he stepped back. "I shouldn't come here anymore," he said. I nodded. But we both knew he would. The rain started again that night, just as it had the first time. And somehow I knew it wouldn't stop for a long time. The days after that night moved strangely. On the surface, life went on as it always had. Daniel and I ate dinner, watched TV, talked about bills. I worked my shifts, bought groceries, waved to neighbors. But underneath there was this current, this pull, that made every moment feel different. I'd see Aaron's truck parked a few streets over sometimes, and my pulse would quicken even though he didn't stop by. Sometimes I wondered if he lingered. There on purpose, just close enough so I'd notice. One Wednesday afternoon, I came home early from work. The air inside the house was quiet, still holding that faint scent of cedar from the kitchen cabinets. I barely set my bag down when there was a knock at the door. Aaron stood there, rain clinging to his hair, his gray t-shirt damp at the shoulders. "Forgot I still had your garden shears," he said, holding them up. I could have just taken them, thanked him, and shut the door. I should have. But instead, I stepped back. "Come in," he did, brushing past me, and his arm grazed mine. Not hard enough to be called a touch, but enough to make my breath catch. We ended up in the kitchen again. Always the kitchen. Maybe because it felt small, contained. Maybe because that was where it had started. "You've been avoiding me," he said after a moment, not accusing, just stating a fact. I had to. My voice came out softer than I intended. His gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before meeting my eyes again. "And now?" I didn't answer. He took a slow step closer. I'd stop if you told me to." I thought about Daniel. About the years we built together. But also about the ache I'd been carrying for weeks. The way Aaron's presence filled a space I hadn't even realized was empty. I didn't tell him to stop. We didn't rush. It wasn't frantic. He reached for my hand first, fingers warm against mine, pulling me just close enough to feel his breath on my cheek. There was no going back after that. The world outside the kitchen disappeared. When he finally left, I stood at the sink, staring out the window at the wet garden, feeling a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration. Over the next month, we fell into a rhythm. He'd stop by with excuses, a loose fence post, a bag of lemons from his tree, an old book he thought I'd like. The visits never lasted long, but they were enough to keep that undercurrent between us alive. Then came the night. Everything shifted. Daniel had gone out with colleagues. The house felt unusually warm, the air heavy. Aaron texted, "Outside." Gates open. I stepped into the garden and found him leaning against the fence, the moonlight catching in his hair. We didn't speak. He just took my hand and led me inside. The kitchen was dim, only the light above the stove glowing. His hands found my waist, pulling me in, and this time there was no hesitation. Every movement was deliberate. Every pause charged with something unspoken but understood. We stayed there for what felt like hours, not just tangled in touch, but in everything we couldn't say out loud. The sound of rain started again outside. Faint at first, then steady, like it had been waiting for this moment. When it was finally over, we stood side by side at the sink, both staring out into the dark. "I told you I shouldn't come here anymore," he said quietly, I know. But neither of us meant it. Aaron didn't come by for a week after that night. At first, I told myself it was for the best. We crossed a line and maybe space would let things settle. But by the third night, I found myself glancing at the clock every hour, listening for a knock that never came. I'd replay the way his hands fell on my waist, the way his voice dropped when he said my name. It was late Friday when I saw him again. I'd gone outside to water the potted herbs near the kitchen door. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel. I thought maybe you didn't want to see me, he said, his voice low, almost cautious. I don't know what I want anymore. He stepped closer, stopping just inside the porch light. I do. There was something in the way he looked at me that made my knees feel unsteady, like the world outside didn't exist, like the only real thing was this pull between us. Opened the door and let him in. We didn't speak much as we moved into the kitchen. His hand brushed my back as I set the watering can down, and I felt that same heat I'd been carrying since the last time. He leaned against the counter, studying me. Tell me to leave, and I will. Tell me to stay. I didn't say either. I just took one step toward him. That was all it took. His hands were on me, pulling me close, his lips finding mine with a slow, deliberate pressure that deepened until I forgot to breathe. The kiss wasn't rushed. It was unhurried but consuming, the kind that left my whole body leaning into him. When his fingers threaded into my hair, I let out a sound I didn't mean to, soft, involuntary. He must have felt it because he smiled against my mouth before, kissing me harder. The small kitchen suddenly felt too small, the counters too close, the walls too near. His arms wrapped around me fully, pressing me back until my hips touched the counter. I could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, drawn and steady. While mine raced out of control. We stayed like that for a long while, his forehead resting against mine when we finally broke for air. You make it impossible to walk away, he murmured. You think it's easy for me? I whispered back. He kissed me again, slower this time, his thumb brushing over my cheek like he was memorizing my face. I felt the warmth of his breath, the strength in the way he held me. Not rough, but certain. That night stretched into something more than I had expected. We talked in the low glow of the stove light, our words quiet, but every touch was louder than anything we could say. The kitchen became a world of its own, our own. When the clock edged toward midnight, he stood behind me at the sink, his arms around my waist, chin resting on my shoulder. We watched the rain outside, neither of you smoothing. I'll never forgive myself, I whispered. I'm not asking you to, he said softly. I just want tonight. And so we stayed, wrapped up in each other until the hours blurred and the sound of rain was replaced by the first hum of morning. By the time he left, the sky was pale gray. My hands still smelled faintly of him. I stood at the sink long after his truck disappeared, knowing nothing in my life would ever feel the same again. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments. A brush of his fingers when passing in the hallway. A glance that lingered too long. A message sent at midnight that I read under the covers. My husband asleep beside me. It couldn't last. I think we both knew it. It was a Thursday when it happened. The end. The sky was heavy with the kind of clouds that promised rain but never broke. I was washing a single coffee mug at the kitchen sink when I saw his truck slow in front of the house. He didn't park. He just sat there for a few seconds. Engine running. Then he pulled in. When he walked in, he didn't smile. His eyes were steady but darker than usual. We can't keep doing this, he said, and his voice was low, almost breaking. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. I know. Then why do I want to kiss you right now more than anything? That was the undoing of us. He stepped closer, and I didn't step back. Our mouths met with all the weight of everything we'd been holding in. Weeks of longing, guilt, fear, and need poured into one kiss that was rough at first, then slowed, then deepened again. His hands cradled my face. My fingers gripped the back of his shirt. It wasn't hurried. It was desperate, but in a way that wanted to remember. Every breath, every brush of lips, every small sound between us. It felt like we were trying to write the last chapter with our bodies before someone tore the book from our hands. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead on mine. We stood there in the kitchen, breathing in sync, my hands still gripping him like I could stop him from leaving if I just held on hard enough. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it. For not being able to walk away sooner. And for walking away now." My vision blurred, but I didn't let the tears fall. "Go, before I ask you to stay." He lingered for a second longer, his thumb brushing across my lips, then stepped back. He didn't look at me again as he walked to the door. The sound of his truck starting felt louder than it should have. I stood at the sink, the same place it all began, staring out at the empty street. My reflection in the glass looked like someone I didn't recognize, a woman who had been both broken apart and put back together by something she could never keep. And when the rain finally came, I stayed there, letting it wash against the window, knowing that no matter how hard I tried, I'd always remember the way he felt behind me, arms around my waist, holding me as if I belonged to him. Because for a little while I had.